Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the final DLI webinar of spring 2023. We have a good one for you tonight. I'm joined by my friends, Pastor Marcus Briggs and Pastor Michael Scobie. You'll hear more from them in a moment, but I just encourage you to log on, take your Bible out, get a good journal and paper. What is fantastic is that we have several students at Vibrant College who are in the room next door to Pastor Michael, and they don't know he's going to be on. So now there's a surprise. So shout out to the Vibrant students, and glad you guys have joined us tonight. As always, if you watch this live, you will get credit. It just takes us a little time to update the grades, so don't panic if it takes a few days for us to show that you were here live. If you're watching this later and you're seeing it recorded, you will need to write a one-page paper and submit that. But I want to thank you all for a great semester. Really, this has been great. You guys are all staying on top of your work and just doing a really good job, and I'm grateful for you. But tonight we wrap up our conversation on calling. And I called a little bit of an audible because last week I had the privilege of traveling to Sri Lanka on a ministry trip with Pastor Marcus, Pastor Michael, and several others. And just through the follow-up conversations that we had, we were talking a lot about how much the trip impacted us more than we felt we might have impacted them. Like, it was just such a powerful time for us. And we're not going to just tell you, this isn't like a mission Sunday where we just tell you all the stories from the field and, take up an offering at the end. But instead, specifically regarding calling, what struck us is how God used people in very modest circumstances without a lot of material possessions to offer. People that have never taken the DESC profile or the Enneagram or the spiritual gift inventory to make a huge difference for his kingdom. And it just sort of ignited a fire in me that I think so often we talk a lot about calling. When people, our brothers and sisters around the world, they're just doing it and they're not having to think about it. And, will you pray for me? Can you help find my calling? And Pastor Michael, I know you're in a You Asked For It type series where, you're taking questions. And that's a question that comes up a lot in the West is, how do I find my calling? What am I supposed to do? And that's a valid question, and it's something that we'll deal with, that we've dealt with all semester. But tonight I want to kind of just simplify it a little bit and say, okay, just do what's in front of you, seize the day, make every day matter, and then you'll end up finding your calling. But before we dive in, why don't you guys introduce yourselves? So Marcus, you're first on my screen. So why don't you talk a little bit about yourself? And then also, because we have talked about calling so extensively this semester, why don't you just take a moment and talk about kind of how maybe some of your part of your journey, however you want to share it, that led you to where you are now.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? Marcus Briggs, pastor in Shreveport, Louisiana, River Park Church, and it is a joy and pleasure. And I think Mark is right next door in our other offices, and so he's probably shocked that I'm on here right now. So what's up, Mark? Shout out. But I think probably for me, calling the way it came to be is I was raised. I'm a fourth generation pastor on one side of my family, a fifth generation on my mom's side of my family, and I didn't even have cool uncles. They were all pastors too. And so I think that calling was kind of always there. The availability was there, the opportunity was there, but calling's not just those things. It's also where you find joy. My dad made serving in church look fun. My dad made serving people look fun and exciting. And then when I started recognizing that, not only did I enjoy this, but also my talents seemed to align with that. Giftings seemed to align with that. It was that's how you kind of discover that, okay, this may be a calling. And then you end up with, for me, I got some confirming words from God during the seasons. I went to school for marketing, got a marketing degree, and went to work doing marketing stuff, but just didn't find fulfillment. Found money, but not fulfillment. And I think that through that that shaping and seasoning, none of it was wasted. God used it and is still using it, but it helped you recognize, okay, there's something more to this. There is a calling that is in that as well.
Yeah. And I think one thing I want to maybe dig a little bit deeper into, Marcus, is that River Park is a very unique church. It's unconventional in a lot of ways. So maybe talk a little bit about what makes River Park different than more, what we're used to, and how your calling and really your dad's always been an innovative thinker, maybe a step beyond his times. But talk about that, because there's a unique family calling to reach a certain type of person that you guys have experienced.
Yeah, I think we reach the people that wouldn't normally go to a normal church for many reasons. Again, calling has to do with what you have, what's in your hand. When God called Moses, he asked, the first thing he said is, "What's in your hand?" And so it's like, and it was his staff, and then it's, "What is your hand? Put your hand in your cloak." And so calling always has to do with what you have. Well, we're blessed. Our property is an abandoned amusement park, so it doesn't look like a church. You come past ticket booths to get in the front gates. Our foyer is outdoors. And then through that, we've been able to restore an old carousel. And so right when you come through, we have a working carousel for kids to ride on Sunday mornings and things like that. So it's a very unconventional church in that respect. Now you get into worship experiences like many of you have and things like that, but it's very unique. And so people that wouldn't normally darken the doors of a church, they're like, "Well, I'll try that," and it creates that. As far as my dad goes, being an outside the box thinker, it's just, he's not just out of the box thinking as far as church goes. He's also out of the box thinking as far as passing the baton and reaching the next generation. The end of Malachi talks about, unless the hearts of the fathers turn to the hearts of the sons and vice versa, that the Lord will smite the land with a curse. Well, it's not that there even has to be a curse. It's almost the results of that we are cursed. It's not that he has to do a thing. It's the automatic results of that, because there is no passing the baton from one generation to the other, or the calling from one generation to the next. And that's probably the best thing that my dad has given me, and that we've been an example for others, I think, is that probably before my dad was ready to retire, he saw that I was ready to lead. And so he stepped out of the way and said, "Let's go." And I think it's been a blessing for our church to have two generations of people that are able to see that transfer of specific calling for River Park to the next generation.
Wonderful. All right, Pastor Michael, why don't you jump in, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about you and about Vibrant.
Yeah, so thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for being on here. So my story is literally the complete opposite of Pastor Marcus's, okay? So everything that was for him, I'm the opposite. So I have no family in ministry. I have no ministry background. None of my family were ever pastors. My father was in the military, was in the Air Force, and we grew up in a Protestant, kind of a Protestant service on base, where they would hit you with a ruler if you moved. And then we ended up going to more of a spirit-filled environment where they would hit you with a ruler if you didn't move. And so, for me, I had a strong relationship with God. I gave my life to the Lord, and I had a good relationship with the Lord through high school. And I had coming out of high school, I had a full ride scholarship to LSU for music. I'm an instrumentalist, play, sing. And so I had planned on going to LSU. And in a setting in June, after I graduated, I had a moment with the Lord where it was kind of like God stopped me in my tracks, and he told me, said that, "Wait, I want you to use what I gave you to serve other people." And I was like, "Well, God, that's what I was going to do." He was like, "But I don't want you to do it there." And so started praying about what this looked like. Long story short, I gave up my scholarship, ended up going to Bible college instead. Been in ministry really ever since, was hired doing worship while I was in Bible college. I got out of Bible college, intended to do worship ministry all my life, but as God has a funny way of doing things, he develops us. And one thing that I know is if we surrender to his call, he'll shape us, and he'll shape us beyond what we thought our capacity was. And so that's exactly what God has done. I've served in music ministry, student ministry, served as an associate pastor, and and God led us to plant Vibrant Church here in the Woodlands, North Houston area in September of 2019. And for me, calling has always been about surrendering to God's voice in my current state. And if I do that, I feel like everything will be okay. But if I try to get in my own talent, I try to get in my own ways, that's where I get in my own way, honestly, of what God has for me. And so calling for me has always been about surrender. It's always been about, okay, God, you exactly what Marcus was saying. God gave me this. What am I supposed to be doing with it? If, obviously not for myself, but to serve other people. And that's honestly what I feel called to do. And that's what we planted a church to do. So hopefully that answers the question, what you'd like there.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And so both of you guys, just great churches, and Michael, yeah, I remember you planted in 19, and then we had this little event happen in March of 2020. So a church that is 5 months old now has to figure out how to go virtual. And so the grace of God on your life and the fact that Vibrant is stronger than ever, despite that, there's not many leaders. I want to just give you kudos. There's not many leaders that could have led through such a season and came out strong on the other end. So it shows that you are doing exactly what you're called to do.
Well, that's very kind. I would say planting before a global pandemic, 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. But if you have a great team, you can do a lot of things.
Great. Well, guys, what I want to do maybe is we don't want to so we're not going to make this like the Mission Sunday where you tell the sad stories and then pass the offering bucket and or shame people like, how dare you not worship? Do you realize I was just somewhere where they had no air conditioning and they had both hands raised? And we're not gonna, that's not the point. But I think we all had maybe a story from our trip together that I think would be worth sharing. And then just setting up this idea of calling as just doing what's in front of you and not overcomplicating it, walking in it. So Michael, you I think you wanted to share a story about one of the young ladies that we met. So go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were so many impactful stories, man. I just kind of reviewing notes that we had from the week, but one lady in particular, I'll kind of give the quick version of her story, was Miss Fatima. And long story short, she was married, a Muslim background, and had 2 beautiful kids, and she was given a Bible and started to just read this Bible in times in secret, right after her kids and had all gone to bed, and her husband, and she started developing this faith in Jesus. And finally, she just kind of had a moment where she's like, "This is it. I'm gonna give my life to the Lord." And she did so, and so she shared this with her husband, and her husband kicked her out. Her husband kicked her and her kids out. And so she had to find a village that was accepting, and she came to this village. I believe I have my notes right. It was like 10 kilometers, right? That she had to travel with her kids in the mountainous region of Sri Lanka, going to this village. And one of my favorite parts of her story was so much could have destroyed her. So much could have made her walk away from faith. But what she ended up doing was finding this village, and now where she was given this Bible from a teacher, now she teaches, and she took what was supposed to be a weakness and turned it into her calling. And so what could have destroyed her and turned it into destiny. And so I think there's so much motivation that I took from that it not only she was given this Bible and checking her kids into school, and that's awesome and it's beautiful, but as she went through all of the turmoil and she walked through that, Fatima now teaches others walking into calling and what God has for her. I just found it really inspiring personally, because you could see a joy all over her that came from the Holy Spirit, that it inspires other people to follow Christ. And it was a joy on her life that's in fact, that's what she said. She told us, she said, "I lost everything, but I gained Jesus. And that's all that matters." And come on, there's nothing more of an impactful statement than that. So I was really inspired by her story.
Yeah. And then the person who led her to Christ, the preschool teacher that gave her the Bible, we had a chance to meet her too. And that's what struck me was like, I think so often in our setting, if someone is working a secular vocation, and they have a heart for ministry, their thought process is always like, how can I do ministry? But this preschool teacher, she realizes that what she's doing is ministry and that she used her platform. And Fatima, her story was, we asked her what drew her to Jesus. It wasn't like, man, I heard a really good sermon, or I went to church and their production was just through the roof. They were done in exactly an hour and 5 minutes. It was none of that. It was, whenever everyone else abandoned me, the Christians, they fed me, they housed me, and they loved me. And that made me know there was something legitimate about this. Talking about calling, like as simple as providing a meal for someone in need is maybe a greater way to walk out our calling than a lot of the things that we put a lot of emphasis on. So Marcus, I know there was a young man who kind of like really caught your attention.
Yeah, man. I mean, kind of like Michael said, there's a million stories we could probably talk about, and all of it was powerful. But one of the coolest stories I thought was over there. I would say it's harder to do ministry in the United States than it is in this country in many ways, not because of oppression or anything like that, but because there they know how to worship, even if it's the wrong God, they know how to worship. And so when you introduce Christianity, they understand worship from the beginning. And I feel like we don't have that here in the United States because we worship self, and we don't even do that well sometimes. But like it's this mistake, if you will, whereas there they've already got that covered and they understand worship. But one of the coolest stories that I heard while we were there was the guy that was a Hindu priest and converted to Christianity. And whenever someone in the room asked what he did as a Hindu priest, it was the coolest thing. He said he used to make idols. That was his job, was to make idols in the priesthood. And I just thought, how cool is it that you've got this guy whose story is now he's a follower of Jesus, who's now a part of the TTI, which is basically training to plant churches and everything like that. He's learning how to plant churches, and his role was to create idols. And now he serves a God who says, "You will have no idols before me." I just thought the narrative of the Holy Spirit to change the role like this, but still allow worship that a guy already has in his heart for God. It speaks directly to what this whole series you guys have been on is. It's calling. It was already there. It just needed to be tweaked and pointed in the right direction. And now you've got this guy that is worshiping the Most High God.
Love it. Along those lines, I met, there was a gentleman who was one of our guides for the trip. He was hosting us. His name was Daniel, super quiet guy, never said much, but I don't know if you guys noticed, he was always smiling. Like I kept trying to catch him not smiling. Like I would just look at him at random times thinking like maybe he's just doing this for the sake of everyone else, but there's always a smile on his face. And so Daniel, on one of the bus rides that we were taking, I asked Daniel about his life, and he said that his dad was the first Christian in his family, and his dad planted a church. That church began to grow in the village, and it upset the village elders, and they didn't want it there. So they ended up having him imprisoned. So his dad was imprisoned and beaten. And then they came for the family. So Daniel and his siblings and his mother had to crawl through the rice paddies to go to a different village so that they wouldn't be beaten themselves. And then eventually, his dad started a church in the prison. And so he became such an irritant to the local prison guards that they let him go just because he was annoying them by, like, he just wouldn't stop planting churches. If they, no matter where they put him or what he did, he kept doing it. Calling, right? Like it doesn't have to be a perfect scenario. You can be in persecution, you can be in a hardship, you can be in a bad season, you can be at your low point. How often have we said, I will really pursue my calling whenever my relationship is stronger, or whenever I'm in a financially more secure place, but like he's in prison, like, well, I guess that's what I'm going to do now but then, so then Daniel said, so through my father's experience, we just learned to love planting churches and to share the gospel. And so I asked Daniel, I said, well, about how many churches, have you and your family planted? He's like, well, between my dad and I think we're around 1,100, which is just like, if that was me, I would lead, like that was buried like 30 minutes into a story. if that was me, I would lead with like, hi, my name's Landon. I planted 1,100 churches. Like, I think that would have been at the very beginning of the conversation. If you go to a pastor's conference with that in your back pocket, like you lead with that. but for Daniel, he was so humble, and so, but it was just it's just his calling. It's what he does everywhere he goes. No matter what happens, he's planting churches. So I think the encouragement that I received from there was this, not to overcomplicate your calling. If you're in prison, you do what God's called you to do. If you're a preschool teacher, you do what God has called you to do. If your family has just abandoned you, you just do what God's called you to do. If leaving the Hindu priesthood to become a Christian and all the consequences that had, but you just do what you have to do. And anything else you guys want to say about that before we kind of move on to some principles that we can practically apply from those stories?
Yeah, I'll add a little to that. So I think many times when it comes to calling, we want all of it right now. We want to see what it's going to look like at the end right now before we say yes, right? And so, but that's just not how God operates. I think many times we want the whole loaf of bread. Like, God, give me the whole loaf of bread, what it's going to look like at the end. But in reality, what we should be looking for is the breadcrumb. And by one, we're picking up the breadcrumb, and God's going, okay, go back to the breadcrumb, go next one. And then you grab the next one. And so much of calling is just doing the next right thing. What is the next right thing that God put right in front of you? And eventually you end up with this full loaf of bread. And you're like, okay, God, it totally makes sense. But if we're looking for the whole loaf of bread up front, God's not going to give that to us because we may not be ready for that. Or we may not be willing to say yes to that full loaf, but we'll say yes to the breadcrumb right now. We'll get to the loaf and it'll make sense, but we've got to be willing to trust God in that process. And that's something that really impacted me because I saw that so many times with that church, all of the churches in Sri Lanka that we saw.
Right. And maybe the other cool part of the story is that what we witnessed there, but then even what we witnessed among the team. So the three of us, we're friends, we're all called differently. And in working together, there are times where our gifts kind of showed up. And my wife is sitting beside me. She doesn't want to come on camera though. But like, we all agree, Sarada, like, she stole the show. Like, we're all like the pastors, the leaders. We're brought on the trip, and like Sarada comes, and everyone falls in love with her because she has a calling, a ministry of prayer. And most of the time, honestly, it's overlooked. Like, there's people that she prays for, intercedes for, and that's not a public thing that everyone knows is happening, but it's on her heart. She is a prayer. If you need something, let her pray about it. There's that's just what she's called to do. Well, in that setting where all the women, like all the churches, 80% women that were coming, that were there for us in the meetings. Well, because of cultural restrictions, there was a little bit of trepidation that they would have with coming to a male. But beyond that, the calling in Sarada, just like we'd be ready to leave. We're eating our KFC in the bus, and she's still she's still 20 deep in a prayer line of people that just like, hey, before you go, can you pray for me and can you bless me? So what we saw is like that was really her area to shine. Both of you guys have to use your musical talents kind of on the spot. I was the one who had the privilege to sort of organize the trip and make the connections and relationships to make it all happen. But what it made me think about, and I think this is really important when it comes to calling, is how often we compare our callings to someone else. And we, like even in my own marriage, like we're just called differently. I'm not sure that I have the stamina to pray for 25 people. And if I do, I need a nap afterwards. Like if I have to listen to 25 people's burdens in a language that I'm not familiar with through a translator and then pray for all of them, like I'm going to go to the back. But she left feeling energized and just full of life. And like, I can't believe I get to do this. And so I think I was reviewing the end of John's gospel, and Peter has just been restored to ministry after his big failure. And that's whenever Jesus comes to him and says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I love you. But he uses a different word for love. Like Jesus says, do you agape love me? And Peter says, no, yes, Lord, I phileo, like I love you. Jesus says, do you unconditionally love me? Peter responds back, Lord, I love you like a brother. And I don't want to get us too sidetracked, but essentially what's happening there is that Peter is saying, I would like to say I agape love you, but my recent history has indicated that I don't. Like I can't overlook the fact that just a week ago I was saying, Lord, I don't know you. I denied you. But after that moment of him being restored, and then it's beautiful that Jesus ends that conversation with, it starts with, do you unconditionally love me? Yes, I love you like a brother. No, Peter, really, do you unconditionally love me? Yes, Lord, I love you like a brother. And then Jesus says, well, do you love me like a brother? Like that Jesus was eventually willing to just accept the best that Peter had, which is also great when it comes to our calling, is that sometimes we think that it has to be where it needs to be before we offer it. But in all reality, Jesus takes the best that we have. And, and whatever you've got in this moment is good enough for Jesus to use. But then Jesus said, okay, well then follow me. And so he gives him the same call that he gave him at the very beginning before he fell. It's like, hey, I'm giving you a brand new chance, a new opportunity. And then what does Peter immediately do? He looks over his shoulder and sees John and says, well, what about him? What's his calling? Like, what's he going to end up doing? And man, that hit me so hard, because this is my own life, that sometimes I can't really appreciate what God's doing in my own life, my own calling, because I'm looking at like, man, what about Marcus, man? Like Marcus is magnanimous and magnetic, and people love him, and he's just got like this natural way that with people, and Scobie is innovative, and like he just kind of gets what it looks like to plant a church, and like I'm this like awkward, quiet, if you ever need a book read, I'm your guy. Like, and so I can start looking at my own calling and go, man, I'm not really cut out to do this, because I'm not like, and we're just being really transparent here because we've all thought it, right? Because I'm not like you. It makes me wonder, like, well, am I even supposed to be doing what I do, because I'm so different than everyone else? And we've all faced those obstacles. And so I think a real big part of calling is not to fall into the Peter syndrome of going, but what about him? How does my calling align, with someone else's?
I think it's interesting too, Landon, that the way that you mentioned Jesus kind of adopting the starting point of Peter. So Peter wouldn't come over to where Jesus was saying, so, okay, I accept where you're at. And that's where calling always starts. And Michael, you referred to this a while ago, and I think it's so true. Calling never has to do with where you're going to be. It always begins at where you are, because you're called in that place, and not just for that place, but from that place. And so like, it's like you're called from that place. And if you look at the story of Abraham, whenever he is called into Canaan, whenever he's called into the promised land, and we now know that our God Yahweh is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we see those three. But what's interesting about that, I didn't realize this till a few years ago in studying it in Genesis, it's 10 or 11, I think it's 11, in Genesis 11, where Terah was actually, which is Abraham's father, or he was the one that was actually called first, because it says that Terah left from Ur of the Chaldeans and went out, and it says he was headed for Canaan when they stopped short at Haran. And so it's interesting that we would be saying today that God is the God of Terah, Abraham, and Isaac, if it not been of him stopping short of his calling. And I think sometimes you mentioned the breadcrumbs earlier, we fall and we finally find a big crumb, and it's still a crumb, but it's a big one. And we think, this is the spot. This is my calling. It's where it is. But God's calling is never just to a single place. It's always from a place as well. And so if we would keep following in that calling, we walk into our calling, and we'll always be walking into our calling. It's whenever the children of Israel stopped walking that they got in trouble. So if we continuously walk into our calling, it's our safest place to be.
So good.
It's also about pursuing God's best for our lives, right? I think we all want God's best, but what happens is many times we get in the way of God's best. And when I study biblical stories and I look at my own life, I am never at my best when I'm comparing my calling to anybody else. I am never at my best. You're either going to compare yourself and think you're worse than them, or compare yourself and feel like you're farther along than what you really are. You're never going to be winning. So what's best is actually to set the mental and spiritual discipline that I'm just going to refuse. And honestly, those of you that are out there part of church plants, it is ingrained in the culture, unfortunately, to compare. Just rebuke it. Don't do it. It will lead you down a time of discontent, and you'll feel like you haven't done anything when you've been winning people to the Lord and you've been baptizing them. If you planted a church and you've won one person, you have done enough, and that is okay. We've got to be content right where we're at, but we're not going to do that if we're constantly comparing ourselves. It keeps us from God's best in our lives, and I think that's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
Or you'll do things outside of your calling.
Yeah. Well, let's stay here for a moment. Like in this webinar and in previous ones, I've been kind of transparent personally about sometimes that I feel like I've been wired a little differently and trying to fit into this world. But I do that because I think I always have to remember, Marcus, you've helped me remember this before too, is that how others perceive me is not always how I perceive myself. And so coming from a place of leadership, it's just great to say, hey, like I struggle with these same lies and insecurities about my calling. So Marcus, why don't you, what's been an insecurity about your calling that you've had to just shut up?
Which one?
One.
Oh man, I think and again, I think you face different issues with the history and background you come from. So as Michael already kind of juxtaposed here, that he and I come from very different backgrounds, and so the comparables of others is one thing, and the comparables that you compare yourself to is quite another. And I think that, but you fight both of those fronts. It's like fighting a battle on two different fronts: what people expect of you and what you expect of yourself. But your expectation of self, if it's filled with other images of what others look like and what you should look like them, it may not be your calling. And I think one of the toughest things I've had to face is my dad is about as freaking awesome of a dad as you can possibly have. I'm not sure I can say that on a DLI webinar, but
You just did, yeah.
I'm not paid by DLI, so awesome. And we're out of the box church. I think it's been, my dad is an amazing man of God, amazing leader, all these things. And I think the expectation has been that Marcus will be his dad. And one of the things that God has had to shape in me is that don't let those expectations lead you of what others think of you in this. There are parts that is going to be exactly like it's like a birthright. It's going to come out of you, but there are parts that are very different. And I've had many men of God, including my dad, bless that in me and say, you are going to be different, and it's okay. And to follow that calling and to follow what is different in that. And I think that's very beautiful. I think one of the things that really helped me in scripture on that was actually the first chapter of Matthew, which is skipped by everyone whenever you're reading the Bible, because all it is genealogy. But there's a powerful statement in there because it identifies Adam as the son of God and Jesus as known as the son of Joseph. So get this picture. The one we worship is known, that's what scripture says, as the son of Joseph. Adam, the one who screwed everything up, is known as the son of God. And I think that often when it comes to calling, we try to prove our way by saying we operate from what we are known as, trying to fight off what we're known as, instead of operating from what we know we are. Wow. We are the Son of God. We are sons and daughters of God. Jesus operated from what he knew, not what he was known as. He operated from that. And I think that's what allowed him to step into his call. And I think when we operate from what we know we're called to do, we can step into that so much easier than if we try to operate from what people know us as. And I think that's been the most unique challenge for me, is to recognize I'm not my dad.
Yeah.
I just won't be. I'm not my grandpa, who's the greatest human to ever walk the earth, according to most people I meet. I mean, like, it's just I'm not those people, and I have to recognize that I won't be. And people will constantly try to put that box there. But the only way I'll fulfill the calling that God has placed on my life is to operate in what I know I am in Him, not what people know me as.
Great. Great.
For me, Marcus, mine is the exact same, but from the opposite side, right? With me not having ministry background, and I'm probably speaking to somebody that's in this webinar tonight, is that I battle the mentality of, you're not good enough to do what you're doing right now. You're not worthy. You don't have the worthiness to do what you're doing. And so one thing that my pastor has really helped me with is that, and you use some of this very language, is for me to understand my sonship in Christ, my sonship. And that is what gives me the authority to do what I do. And so from the opposite side of it, where you're saying, I'm not my dad, I'm not them, I also have to go, my dad was a great man, but I'm not my dad. I'm not a military guy. Like I'm not called to go do that. God put me here to do this. And I'm also not my other relatives that have, major issues. I am not them either. And so I don't have to accept generational curses on my shoulders that Jesus already died for. And I don't have to accept those on my life. I can accept sonship that leads me into purpose and calling that is greater than I could ever have capacity for inside of me. But if I'm willing to accept that sonship that comes with responsibility, it comes with discipline. Remember, anytime, like those of you that have kids, you're like, I tell my kids that when I drop them off for school, attitudes is a choice, right? Attitudes is a choice, and scobies are strong. Scobies are strong. It attaches to a name. And I think there's something, a part of being a son of God, that is just, or a daughter of God, that you're just like, hey, I'm going to take on these attributes. And for me, I have to remind myself of that every day, because the enemy likes to hit me with, you're no good, Bubba. You don't have the, you don't have the background to stand on. You don't have the grandpa that you haven't built anything. You haven't done anything. And it's important for me to remind myself of the sonship part of that.
That's great. And I'm grateful that you were obedient to God, because you are a great pastor. But I'm also grateful because I don't know that I trust you with my national security. So I'm glad that God has you in the chair that you're in for the sake of our nation.
I'm just glad I didn't lose my passport over there, but it was real close.
This is really great stuff, because I think what we often feel is that everyone has these insecurities. Everyone suffers with imposter syndrome. But normally the further up you climb in leadership, the more incentive you have to hide that, because you think, I really need to put on my strong face. Never let them see you sweat. But then what happens is that for all the people that are like watching this webinar, and all the people in our churches that are struggling with calling, struggling with imposter syndrome, they don't get these honest conversations that we're having right now, where we are all comparing. There's a temptation for all of us to compare our gifts to someone else, and to wonder. Maybe one other thing we can talk about, and then we'll take some questions. So students, if this has elicited any kind of question, and you please respond there. But one other thing that I think is worth mentioning is we just talked about some very difficult situations and circumstances in Sri Lanka. We've also hinted at, like, there are things in leadership that we love to do, and there are things that are challenging for us. But there is a grace, and I think this is one way of knowing how you're called. There is a grace to do the thing. So like planting churches in a persecuted nation, I don't think I currently have the grace for that. But Daniel never stopped smiling, and so how do we use that idea that when we're doing what we're called to do, it brings this joy, even though it may not make sense to other people?
My take on it is kind of looking at Jeremiah 1. Okay. You're looking at the calling of Jeremiah. God tells him one thing, and he says, do not be afraid of the people. The calling is always connected to people. It's always connected to people. And so if you are called, it's going to connect you to people regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the hardships. If you can get to serve the people, you're going to find fulfillment, and you're going to find peace where you're at. I'll tell you, a peace that comes from God's calling is a whole lot better than a personal preference. And and so I think ministry is all about people. We all know that, but our calling is all about people. And so whatever that thing is, you're called to this for people. And I think if we keep that at the forefront, the circumstances are going to change. Life is going to change. Circumstances will come and go, mountaintops, valley lows. We can get through that if we understand the why behind all of it.
So good.
Yeah, man, I'll echo that, because preach, man. The greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the Lord says on these two hinge all of the law and the prophets. And so I think if we don't understand that, if God only wanted us for him, then as soon as he saved us, he'd rapture us out of here.
Yeah.
But there's a purpose, and it has to do with people. And so anytime I just want to stand up and shout for a second, Michael, we'll go old school, because I think what you're saying is exactly true. Because if we disconnect the person from our calling, or the people from our calling, or even think that our calling is to criticize the person and put down the person, we miss the whole point of calling. It is to build up. That's the word of scripture is for the building up, the equipping of the saints, not the destruction of those that don't get it right. It's to equip those to get it right. And so the moment we quit recognizing that it's about these people, it messes us up. I think the other thing that I would add to answer your question about how, like you said, you don't feel like you have the grace, Landon, to do that. My dad used to say he ran from his calling as a preacher for years because he did not want God to call him to Africa.
Right.
And he was like, I do not want to answer that because I don't want to go to Africa. And I think that's very true, that sometimes we run from our calling because we think God will call us to something we don't want to do. That could be the case. But what God will do is morph your desires through the time and the process over. Like if he calls you to something, he'll also change the desires of your heart. He'll shift that for you and give you the desires of your heart. And some of us think of that from a non-Christian text, and we're like, oh, that's scary. But really what he's going to do is he's going to change the desires of your heart to where our desires become his desires. And what's cool is whenever you told us kind of what we were talking about, I just pulled up a bunch of notes, Landon, as we always do. And one of the things that God was working on me in my personal Devo time about a month ago was on calling, and it's in Ezekiel. I'm going to read this. It's Ezekiel 2, 9, and 10. It says, then I looked and saw a hand reaching out to me. It held a scroll, which he unrolled, and I saw that both sides were covered with funeral songs, words of sorrow, and pronouncements of doom. That sounds awful. I mean, none of that sounds good at all. And it's the scroll. But then if you go down in Ezekiel chapter 3, it says, the voice said to me, son of man, eat what I am giving you. Eat this scroll. Then go and give this message to the people of Israel. So again, you have God and people, the connection here. But it says it's all doom, it's all gloom and everything. If you read verses 4 and 5, I believe it's 4 and 5 of Ezekiel 3, it says that the scroll tasted like honey to him as he was eating it. And that is the epitome of calling. What looks like doom, gloom, funeral songs, words that are awful, to if you're called, it will taste like honey to you because it's what God has put you in to bring to the people.
That's beautiful. I love it. I love it. And I think we all see that there are things that you do, like even though we have roughly the same job description, right? But there are things that you do that you're like, man, I love to do that. And for me, it tastes like funeral songs, but for you, it tastes like honey. And there are things that I do that for you would taste like a funeral song. I got the hard copy of my dissertation in the mail today. Like, check.
Come on, Landon, flex it, bro. Flex it. Let's
go.
go.
There it is. There it is. Hours I would imagine for either one of you, such a project would be like, nope, that is a that is a nasty funeral song if I had to eat that. But for me, man, I loved every moment of, I didn't love the deadlines, but like I loved just sitting alone in my office with time to write and all my books out in front of me and see it, like it was honey to me. So I think that's what we're saying is you'll find whatever your thing is going to be sweet to you, and other people are going to be like, how do you do that? Like why do you enjoy that? Why do you
And I got asked that question today. We had a pretty severe shooting happen in North Bossier today, Michael, your old stomping grounds, man. And it was horrible, man. Police officer was involved. He was shot 5 times, and then 2 people were killed on the scene, and an innocent bystander. And I had to go to the hospital because I work as a chaplain on the police department, and got to go over there and be with the officer and his family, pray with them. And then I happened to run into the girlfriend of the guy, innocent bystander, on the way out, which is the Holy Spirit. It's not coincidence. That's the Holy Spirit. So I got to be with her and her family for a little bit and pray with them. And somebody, when I came back, they said, man, I'm so sorry you had to do that. And I'm like, why? I was like, I'd rather be in the middle of the solution than wondering whether or not something is there to bring peace. And it was just the perfect thing. And I think it's exactly right. The only reason that was good for me and they saw it as bitter was because that's calling. That's my calling.
Yeah, so good. We got a couple questions that are rolling in, so let's begin to tackle those. Let's talk about some steps that we can take in that, recognizing our unique calling. Like I am the way that God made me to be. I'm gonna lead in that way, minister in that way, without making allowance for shortcomings and flaws. Because we definitely know people like that too. Like, well, I'm called as a prophet, which means I'm going to say whatever I want, and if it offends you, it's, well, John the Baptist offended people either too. It's like, well, yeah, you're not John the Baptist though, bro. It's like, Jesus turned over the tables. Yeah, he did that one time. Like it happened once, and you're not Jesus. So, how do we kind of walk in our calling, but not let that become an excuse for some shortcomings and flaws?
So you have to, I really enjoy the combination of discovering this calling, looking at mission, gifting, and passion, putting this all together. But all of these 3 are a balancing act together. Like, where am I needed? Where am I gifted? What am I passionate about? Like, you guys remember Sanjaya with American Idol probably 15 years ago? Do y'all remember him? He was in American Idol. The guy couldn't sing worth anything, but people kept voting for him. And he made it into the top 8. And he was just one of the worst singers ever. But he got a recording contract, right? He was not gifted in singing, right? But that Americans focus so much on the passion. I'm passionate about this. This must be what I'm called to do. And they will tackle that so much to the point where they miss out on where they're needed, or where they're actually gifted at. And so I think it's very important to not let these 3 areas get pulled so far apart, and you end up chasing one to another rather than combining those forces together. That's where you can find some health in calling, because if you're really passionate about one thing, but that's part of the calling, and you only do the part you're passionate about, you're going to miss out on some of the growth that might come from the mission that's involved. You miss out on some of the humility that comes in with some parts of your calling, or you'll miss out on some growth that comes from the gifting. And so I think it's important to stay balanced in our calling, combining those 3 together. That would help us long term and just creating health in the calling.
Yeah, and remember the primary call is to follow Jesus, right? That and everything else is secondary. And so as we're following him, those rough edges, if we're taking our discipleship seriously, we'll get sorted out. And I think about what Peter tells us, to grow in grace and knowledge. And I feel like there's this big impetus to grow in knowledge, like to grow in skill, to grow in ability. But the call to discipleship is also to grow in grace. And so making sure that as we're pursuing our calling, we're not neglecting our discipleship, and that we're not choosing leadership over discipleship. And as we remain closer to him, those edges those rough edges will get, rubbed thin a little bit. Something else I would think, this is also where like a strong mentor in your life will help you,
Yes.
because they will be able to help you see that's not your calling, that's just you being a jerk. And I've had people have those conversations with me, and I'm sure both of you have had those conversations as well, where there's times where someone else that you're close to, whether it's a mentor or a close friend, they can help distinguish, like, yeah, that's not your calling, that's just you.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen that in your own life and ministry?
100%. I think your statement a while ago, quoting Peter about growing grace and knowledge, I think it's ordered that way intentionally too.
Sure.
If knowledge comes first, then you're puffed up, you're prideful, but if grace comes first, and sometimes, so many times we allow our knowledge to outrun our grace, and it can mess with us. But and Paul, you probably didn't mean the question to sound like this, but just addressing the specific question on there. How do you practically take steps to continue to solidify yourself in the I am the way God? The one thing, you probably didn't mean it this way, but I'm going to just use this as an opportunity. I think that you don't get to solidify yourself in a calling. God gets to solidify you in a calling. I think you have to remain flexible in your calling and pliable for God to move you into new states and stuff like that. So I think the moment we begin to do it, we make statements like, I did the best with what I had. Well, the problem with that statement is you were the doer and it was what you had. When God calls us to work with his tools, with what he has and what he does. And so I think if we try to solidify ourselves in that calling, sometimes we'll solidify what God wanted mobile. Yeah. And it can mess us up.
Do either of you have an example of something where you felt like,
yeah,
I'm walking my calling, but it was really just a personality defect or flaw?
I swore up and down that I was a teacher, not a preacher, for the first however many years of feeling called to ministry. I'm going to teach the word. I'm not going to be hyped. That is not my personality. These guys know me really well. That is not my personality at all. I am hyped in every other area of my life. We go hard, we go at it. I mean, like, so it was the biggest lie I could give myself. And where that lie came from is I didn't want to be compared, because I knew I wasn't as good as some other preachers that I knew. I didn't know the word like they knew. I didn't know I could teach it, but I couldn't preach it. And it was like, and it was me running from a calling, but I was solidifying, this is who I am. I said I'm a teacher, not a preacher. I'm a teacher, I would say it over and over and over. And I was solidifying myself in what I thought was a calling. And God's like, no, you're a teacher right now because you haven't developed the ability to preach yet. You're going to develop that. And this is where we're moving you towards. And who knows where you may move me to next. I may move back to teaching. But what I know is that I almost solidified myself in a place that was not where God was calling me into.
Okay.
Well, I think accountability is so important when it comes to calling, which we were talking about mentorship and honestly, just having a pastor that can call you on things. Accountability is they're best friends with calling. And so if you have somebody that you can be accountable to, that can call you on where you're making error, but then also speak vision into your life. When you're struggling, when you're in the bottom of the valley, when your mentality is struggling, you don't feel like you have clear vision, they can help you clarify. But you have to be willing to be accountable to somebody. And that is something that our generation is missing right now, that we need a revival of.
Yeah, love it. And so a really practical example for me is like, I've had to learn that I'm not the extrovert life of the party, right? Like I walk in that, but still the unhealthy part of me can withdraw. And so I've got people in my life, friends, Marcus, we've known you for a long time, that can say like, hey, you're like, this isn't just you being like a little introverted, like you're withdrawing, like you're intentionally stepping away from, and it's not healthy. And so I can't use that as well. That's just how I am. I'm just not really a people-y person, but and then excuse, discipleship is about community. Ministry is about loving people. I do what I do because I love the people. As Michael said, like, this isn't about the work I'm doing. The work is always a relationship to the people. And in John 17, Jesus says, I finished the work that you gave me, Father, and I've kept the people.
Right.
Like the work was always about the people. The words were always about the people. I'm not preaching a sermon, like I'm preaching to people, and the sermon is just the vehicle to get there. Like the sermon's not the point. The people are the point. And I know that, but when I'm unhealthy, like I still want to withdraw. And I've got people in my life, including my lovely wife, who just will let me know, hey, like this isn't just you being you. This is unhealthy. And so having people in your life is gonna help you there. I think here's a really interesting question that I want us to address is dealing with comparison to other preachers, feeling inadequate, which I think we've talked a little bit about that. But when you don't feel like your preaching is the right style for the church where you're currently serving. So let me start us off here. The first thing is that God will ultimately get us to where he wants us. But man, what an opportunity, if you're a preacher, to learn how to preach in a style that's not your own. What a gift that is to flex a different muscle, because that will take you so far whenever you're like, I can preach, because as someone who travels and preaches some, like there's a different vibe at River Park than there is at Grace where I am. And as a communicator, I've got to kind of learn to fill out the audience, and I'm going to be true to myself, but I'm also going to be true to the house where I'm serving. So this is just a great opportunity, is how I see it, to, flex your muscles and to learn a skill that may not come naturally to you.
I think it's important for us to have the mentality of a sponge, right? Yeah. That you've got to soak that up and say, okay, this is a weakness of mine. This is where I need to get better. Take me in, like, show me. Like, I remember I used to have this Pastor Nathan Keating as my pastor, and we had meetings every time I preached. And I said, I want you to break down my message. Where did I do well? Where did I not do well? And can I tell you, if I was not accountable, if I was not willing mentality, like, to put it before him, it could have offended me, but I just refused, because he's such a great communicator. I wanted to learn. I wanted to be a sponge. Teach me. And it's helped me be a communicator, because now I communicate on a weekly basis, and I don't have a choice. Like, it's what I do. And so I've taken so much of what my pastor has given me. I think you could learn from it and put that into action and start flexing those muscles, but then combine them with your current skill set. And you never know, you might become something that you didn't even think was possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, you have to discover whether or not the purpose of the obstacle in front of you is for you to shape the obstacle or for it to shape you. Sometimes you say, I've got the wrong style for the church that I'm at. Maybe that church is, as we're saying here, it's there for purpose in your life. We went to Sri Lanka to do ministry, and I feel like I was ministered to more than did ministry. And sometimes the thing that's in front of you does that. I think when your preaching feels like it's not the right style for the church that you're at, remember that preaching begins, it's not just words. It's also in the way you dress. It's in the way you look. It's in the way you start. Most of my sermons, I get picked on a lot by Landon and other people, because I preach for 10 minutes before I bring up a scripture. But that's understanding a lot of our context here. I live in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is the most Christian city in the United States. I can almost mention the name of a Bible character and they could preach the sermon. Understanding the context of who I'm talking to, and that if I go somewhere else, I may not do it that way. And so I think shaping it to that feel. If I'm in certain churches, you stand for the reading of the word. And so I will start with the scripture and in that circle. And so ask questions to where you're at. And Justin, answer your question more directly. With the church, it sounds like that's where you are in your preaching. Man, I would take exactly what these other two guys have done here, use it as an opportunity to manipulate your style, not change your style, manipulate your style to fit what's there in front of you. And who knows what God may change in your style as a result of that.
Yeah, definitely. And ultimately our giftings and our callings make room for us. So what I've learned is that if we submit to the process, then ultimately there might be an opportunity for that gifting to flourish, in the church you're in, or there may be something long-term that God has planned that we don't know yet, but it always works out. I mean, I've been in situations, I think we've all been in situations where we felt like our gifts weren't fully being used. So we kind of had to, and Scobie, you've been a little bit of a journeyman. So you've started several different churches where you've really never probably been able to walk fully in your gifts until Vibrant, where you got to use some of your tools in one place and others, and you learned a lot along the way. But because you weren't the lead guy, you didn't get to completely just do things the way that you would have done them if you were the guy. Right.
Right. Yeah. And I would say this, I didn't grow up as intending to be a preacher, right? I intended getting out of Bible college to do music most of my, vocational ministry career. And so when the Lord started working on me, I knew that I needed to grow. And so if you keep that mentality of I need to grow, and not that I've got it all figured out, you'll be okay. But what's the harm in becoming a more well-rounded preacher? Like that sounds like a great thing to me. That doesn't sound like a bad, but I think keeping the mentality of making sure that in every conversation, in every leader, in every conference that you attend, like I'm going to learn something from here. I'm going to learn something from this person. Maybe it's not in what they're saying, but like Marcus was saying it, maybe it's how they're saying it or how they present themselves or how they are off the stage. I'm going to learn from them, man, because I want to be better.
Great. Well, let's tackle one more, and then we'll call it a night. We talked about the importance of mentoring and calling, having someone to help you navigate people, having someone in your life who can see you and help you answer some of these questions. How do you find one, and what should you look for in a mentor?
Well, man, there's a lot of things that could go in here. Number one, I would say somebody that you can be honest with, and that will be honest with you, that you're going to trust, somebody that has experience in where you're wanting to go, or has at least seen the promised land of where you're trying to go. Somebody that has capacity, that is willing, that can take the phone calls, that can take the meetings. You don't want to be hurried through mentorship. That's not mentorship. You want somebody that'll be patient with you, and somebody now that doesn't mean that you just become a time suck for whoever your mentor is, but you need somebody that will be with you and to take that time. But then also somebody that has great character. I think that was the thing that my favorite thing about my pastor is that he's just got great character. I've seen him in situations and he's made the right call, like character wise, even when it hurt him. And that's the kind of leader I want to aspire to be. And maybe that's the ultimate litmus test is this the person you want to be like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think mentorship is a unique term because, as Americans, we all have different words that have different meanings. And so mentor is a tricky word because sometimes we mean accountability, sometimes we mean leader, but we use the word mentor and kind of use them interchangeable. So I guess for my answer on it, I'm going to use it as strictly learning what they do and helping them learn, because there are people that have mentored me in areas that I wouldn't let mentor me in other areas. Okay. So specifically, I know some great preachers that have horrible character. All right. And so I don't mind them mentoring me in that area. Just don't touch the other areas. And so don't confuse mentorship for accountability. I think it can go hand in hand. Don't misunderstand. I think you can have a mentor that holds you accountable, but I think you it may not be the same in all aspects. You're blessed if you can, because you're kind of killing two birds with one stone in some of those instances. But the more, when I'm looking for a mentor, the more areas of my life that I can learn from a single person, the better off I am. Because then I'm not having to spend a whole lot of phone calls, a whole lot of this guy for preaching, this guy for family life, this guy for pastoring, this guy for church growth, this guy, it's like all these different things. And if I can get that into one person as much as possible. And so I'm going to go and echo exactly what Michael said. Character is the number one I'm looking for if I'm going multiple fields, because if they're not true to who God has created them to be, they're not going to be able to answer the questions that make me who I'm supposed to be. In fact, the only thing they can do is make me who they are. And that's not what God wants me to be. God wants me to be who I am with their knowledge and with their wisdom, because that's what ultimately mentorship can give you, is the wisdom and the experience that you may not have to pass through.
Right. And I think practically, this is so good. How to find a mentor, like someone that really is going to speak into you, hold you accountable. We've got to find ways to add value to them as well, because and not just ask from them. So as Dr. Brassfield's obviously my mentor. So I'm always thinking like he's the person I call when I have a need, but he's also the person that I call and say, how can I help? Because if I'm going to take from, I've also got to add to. And sometimes the conversation about mentorship is a little tricky, because it's always about like, well, how can I get this person? And if you see them as your potential mentor, it means they're successful and they're doing things right, which means they're busy. And so like for them to like have to carve out special time for, like, that's fine, but make sure you're adding value, and then that relationship kind of develops naturally. I've had conversations before, someone's like, hey, will you be my mentor? And that's just it's a weird starting point. It really is just finding someone that you trust and that you admire and that you see, and like just get close to them by adding value to them, and then let it develop naturally for that particular like your person who's going to help you. But also you could get mentored by a lot of people, as Marcus said, and just never miss an opportunity whenever you meet someone who's doing something cool to ask questions. There was on our trip, like that's pretty much what we were, all of our bus rides, we were just asking each other things like, what are you doing about this? And how would you handle this situation? And, what's your daily rhythm look like? And what days do you take off? And like, what's your summer travel schedule? Like we just didn't miss an opportunity, because we all admire things about one another, or at least I admire things about you guys. We all admire things about one another and the others that were on the trip, where we're like not missing an opportunity to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, as you said a while ago too, Landon, you can be mentored from a distance too. There are guys that don't know that they're mentoring me, that are mentoring me, through books I read, things like that. So rather than go back to the exact question that was asked, and I don't remember who asked it. Was it Christine? I think that asked it. But I think that the way to answer that is, I don't know that you settle on a mentor. It's probably multiple that you're looking for in different areas of life. Now, there may be one. My dad stands out above all the rest in my life, but I've had other mentors too, Dr. Brassfield, other people that have been mentors and I love what you said, add value to them as they add value to you. That's powerful.
Great. I would just add that not all mentorship is formal. Sometimes it's just about proximity. Get around people that you want to be like, and learn from them, and take notes, like literally take notes, write down in your phone, and just listen to the things that they say. Listen more than you talk. That's mentorship right there. You can call it what you want to. You don't have one-on-one time with them. Listen to how they interact in a group. Just be there. Proximity matters.
Beautiful. Well, guys, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us. There was one more question. I kind of saved it for last, because the question was, when do I know it's time to start living out my calling, walking out my calling? And I think after all we've said tonight, the answer is right now. Whatever's in front of you, seize the day, go for it. Let's uncomplicate it a little bit and just go for it. So thank you guys for joining us. You added so much and had a good time. So thank you all. Anything you want to say before we head out, guys?
Thanks for allowing us to be involved. We appreciate it. If there's anything that I can do or my team can help, just reach out to me and we'd be honored to serve you.
Yeah, I echo that same sentiment. Thank you guys for allowing us to be a part of this.
I'll actually put your personal cell numbers in the chat, so they'll have that. Y'all text them anytime.
They make do not disturb for a reason, bro.
All right, guys. Well, love y'all. Thanks for joining. Students, thank you for watching. I think our semester's about to wrap up, so do all your work. If you're behind, please let us know. We'll do our best to accommodate you and help you finish strong. If you are graduating, your graduation is about a month away at the gathering here in Houston at Grace Church of Humble, my home church. So I'm excited to host you there. You can find more information about the conference at destinyleaders.com. Even if you're not graduating, I really encourage you, come to the conference. It's gonna be a lot of fun. It's you do not want to miss it. So come join us. You can register online. But otherwise, bless you guys, and we will hopefully see you at the gathering in June. God bless y'all. See you soon. Bye-bye.